We here at Vaguely Scientific would like to assure our listeners that we understand your concerns that we might have created a lot of radioactive fallout on the moon. And yes, it's possible that the uprising of homicidal robots might have been partially, but not entirely our fault, and maybe, just maybe, the brain slugs wouldn't have taken over a significant portion of the human population if we didn't let them out in the first place, but we fixed all that, so it's over now. Anyway, I'm going to get back to reanimating all the people who blew up in that explosion last April. This is Vaguely Scientific. Splinter taught us to be ninja teens. I am Derek. Jim is cool but rude, and also he's a party dude. Hi, Jim.
I like the one that has the sigh. Those are cool. Which one's that one?
That's Raphael. He's the best.
He is the best? Good. I chose wisely.
He is one of the four best. I agree.
Yeah.
And when the evil Shredder attacks, our guest this week won't cut him no slack. Welcome back, Adam.
Howdy, folks.
And this is the show where listeners send in questions to hear our vaguely scientific answers. Who knows, we might even get some of those answers right. But first, it's time for the fun science fact of the day. Jim?
Okay. The smallest mountain in the world is Mount Waichiproof, which I did not look up how to pronounce that, but I will say that it is in Australia. It is a mere 138 feet above the surrounding terrain, which, I mean, it's just a hill, but sure, it's a registered mountain, so you do you, Mount Waichiproof.
I have read that they don't take kindly to people calling it a hill.
I'm sorry then. I love Australia, so I don't mean to insult. It's just it's not impressive. I mean, to be fair, it is the smallest mountain. It's not going to be impressive. So, fair play to them.
I also didn't look up the pronunciation or any sort of like regional folklore, but I just sort of thought it was witch-proof, and I wondered if it had something to do with warding off witches.
No, it's. I did see that it was from a like a native language.
Oh, okay.
And it had a definition of what it was, but I've forgotten what that was. I should have wrote it in the science fact.
It's real weird because I assumed when you said that, I just kind of assumed that it was a Welsh name. There was a movie in the mid-90s called The Englishman Who Went Up a Hill But Came Down a Mountain, which is about a Welsh community that the British surveying ministry had to tell them this is not actually a mountain. So they dug up the surrounding countryside and made the hill taller so that it could be officially a mountain.
I dig that.
Yeah. So did they.
So I was going to say that.
Yeah.
That was good.
But I don't remember the name of the hill that became a mountain. But I don't think it was witch-proof.
You said that was a movie. I'm going to have to look that up.
I mean, it doesn't have nearly enough consonants in it for it to be Welsh.
Yeah, that may be so. I can only hear what you're saying.
All right, well, more things to research about this mountain, this Australian mountain hill. But maybe we should move on to our first question, because I've actually done some research into that for today.
Oh my.
I did research? What? Question 1 this week is, could a carnivorous plant eat a human?
Well, so there is an issue that we run into right away.
Okay.
And that is a very simple issue. The issue is that there are no carnivorous plants big enough to eat a human.
Okay.
Parts of humans.
Yeah, I was going to say that doesn't preclude that I mean, we can still answer this question, and there are many things we can talk about, but like you can't just dump a whole human into like a carnivorous plant right now.
That isn't a necessity.
You could breed them to be bigger, maybe. Not the humans, the plants. And that would take a long time, I think.
I suppose if you really wanted the questionable ethics of it, you could breed the humans to be smaller.
Ooh.
There's ethics, probably. I mean, I couldn't find any that were big enough to like toss a baby into, for instance. I don't think that you're gonna get too much smaller than that for human.
Well,
But
there is there's one pitcher plant that can do about 2.5 liters of digestive fluid in the bottom.
oh,
So
okay.
that's probably enough for a very small human. But I don't know if the human would fit through the opening to get to the digestive juices. That I'm not sure of.
One of the things that I was reading that I thought was really interesting was that the digestive juices are capable of digesting things like small mammals. I know that there was one kind of pitcher plant that can eat things like mice. But the issue is that mammals are very big, and their surface area to volume is kind of impractical for things like digesting when you're digesting a whole. Like when a human or any animal goes out and eats something, they don't just eat it whole. Snakes are kind of a big exception to that, but the problem is then the pitcher plant has to digest, and it takes a lot of energy and a lot of time to digest a whole solid mass like a human would be.
I was reading that the biggest carnivorous plant that is currently alive, according to Google, is called Attenborough's pitcher plant.
Oh.
And so I was like, the biggest one alive. Okay, how big is it? And then the first result for that was it's approximately 5 feet tall, a little under that, but that's misleading because that's the whole plant.
Right?
Not the pitcher.
That's not the pitcher itself.
And it took me a while to find, and the only thing I could find, I think Adam might have already answered this, but the thing I could find was that the diameter of the pitcher's opening is usually just a little under 1 foot. So I think that might have been what you were referring to, that like a person might not be able to fit through that opening. Right.
Yeah, I think the I don't actually know the Attenborough's pitcher plant, but Nepenthes raja is the one that I know is the one that's about 2.5 liters of digestive juice.
That's a lot.
And
that's so much.
Yeah, like there's a lot that pitcher can hold, but it's also, it has been known to eat frogs and birds and occasionally rats. But I would imagine one of the problems with mammals and humans, for all that we are, quote, hairless apes, have this problem. The surface area of hair.
Oh, yeah.
And the fluid retention or prevention properties of hair. Like, if a rat goes into one of these things, the amount of time that the rat is inside before any fluid makes it all the way through its fur, right?
Oh, yeah.
And a lot of these plants don't digest when they're digesting insects. They're not digesting the whole insect.
Yeah.
Right? There's stuff left over. Like a Venus flytrap eventually reopens and bits of old fly fall out. And so I'm wondering, fur and bone.
Oh, yeah.
I thought that was... I just thought the fact that they could digest rats and small small mammals like rodents was interesting, because when I was reading, the first carnivorous plant I thought of was the Venus flytrap. I think it's probably the most...
Yeah, it's like the archetypical...
Yeah.
And if you think about this question, we're talking about Audrey 2.
Sure.
We're talking about the Mario Piranha plant.
Yeah, so, that was the one I went to first. I was like, piranha plants.
So I read just... Like, obviously humans are too big for a Venus flytrap to digest, but I read what would happen if you just left your finger inside the mouth of a Venus flytrap for a real long time. And everything that I was reading was saying that you might get some skin irritation, but really it wouldn't do much. And that's when I discovered what Adam already mentions. They don't actually dissolve the entire fly or the entire insect, but I also read that they have trouble with like the chitin exoskeleton. They have trouble digesting. And so I was reading that like digesting small rodents is easier than digesting insects for them.
Oh, interesting.
I could see, like, the meat would certainly be easier, but I'm imagining if something did wind up eating a human, I'm imagining eventually just, like, this matted ball of hair and fingernails being ejected.
Like an owl pellet.
Right. That was what I was thinking. Like, even mammals that eat other mammals don't digest the fur and the bones a lot of times. Like, you have owl pellets, you have, like, I mean, cats make hairballs when they clean themselves. Like, hair is not super digestible. Like, not to get too gross here, but in the phase of changing diapers, over the course of many years, I have discovered that sometimes if my child somehow swallows a hair, it will come out the other end. And that's just a fact of hair. Hair is really not meant to be eaten. So
I am sharing this with you on your 18th birthday.
Good.
So you mentioned two of the things that I put on the list already. Audrey 2, first place I went. But Audrey 2 doesn't actually necessarily need to eat people. He needs to drink blood. And it just becomes easier for Seymour to chop people up and throw them in wholesale than it is to, like, feed him just a supply of blood.
Well, and to be fair, I suspect it also just becomes easier for the species that we know as Audrey 2 to consume an entire human. Like, you don't peel the gelatinous candy off of the gusher in order to get to the fluid inside. You just eat the whole gusher.
That's right. Because I thought of Audrey 2, and because Audrey 2 I already knew was going to be, like, completely an unscientific way to approach answering this question, I decided I'm going to look up other fictional man-eating plants.
Sure. I will point out, the thing about Audrey 2 is not that Audrey 2 is a fictional character, but that Audrey 2 is an alien.
Yes.
So not actually a carnivorous plant, just a creature that appears to us as though it were a carnivorous plant.
That's true. It is arguably not.
Actually, it's as long as we're picking apart fictional carnivorous plant-like beings. Now that we think about the piranha plant, I mean, sure, they bite, but I've never seen a piranha plant eat something else. Like, I've seen them bite Mario to death and Luigi to death, but I've never seen them, like, eat Mario's corpse or something like that.
Could just be a defense mechanism.
Yeah, and anytime a piranha plant does bite Mario bounces.
Yeah.
and like leaves the vicinity of the piranha plant. The piranha plant is not actually trying to consume.
Right. Some piranha plants also breathe fire. I don't know if that's pertinent to the question, but it is pretty cool.
Worth mentioning. But so plant thing that we think of as plant, but is actually an alien, segues fairly nicely into triffids, which I had forgotten about until I started researching this from the old classic movie Day of the Triffids, must watch for all science fiction fans. But in the film, because this is based on a book, it was based on a novel, and in the film they decided that they were an alien life form that was transported to Earth by comets crashing into the Earth's surface. But that contradicts the original movie. Well, sort of. It possibly contradicts it, because not the original movie, the original novel. In the novel, it's never actually explained where they came from, but one of the characters says it is their belief that they are the outcome of a series of ingenious biological meddlings, and very likely accidental at that. Meaning, what Jim mentioned, we could possibly breed plants to be big and human consuming. That is the suggestion in the original book of the Triffids.
All right.
That's interesting. I didn't know that, actually. I don't know much about Triffids, to be honest with you. That's sort of a blind spot in my, like, classic British sci-fi interest.
I learned today that it is apparently common British slang to refer to big menacing plants as triffids.
Good.
So, okay.
I'm glad to hear that.
I'll keep that in mind next time I'm over there.
Yeah. Next time that you need to tear up your lawn and replace it with wildflowers.
The only other one that I wanted to mention exclusively, because I also thought of the Sarlacc pit, which people have told me is more like a plant.
Oh yeah.
But I'm not the Star Wars person, so there definitely people know more about that than I do.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that would make sense with that is that it is a very large organism. And so, because one of the things I was reading about with plants is that they really ideally want to move as little as possible, because any movement action is going to waste a little bit of energy.
Right.
And so, because the Sarlacc pit is very, very large and has a little teeny tiny mouth that can eat like one person at a time, it's on the whole, it's not moving a whole lot. Its entire body is pretty much stationary. It has one little nipper at the top, And so that actually would be designed in a way that I think would work pretty well. It has a gigantic body that barely moves, and then it has the little nippers at the top that's trying to get you. And it digests you extremely slowly.
Extremely slowly. I was just about to say, like, that makes perfect sense that it takes you 1,000 years to pass through its digestive tract.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. It takes 1,000 years?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it hurts a lot.
And
it keeps you alive the whole time.
I don't think it keeps you alive the whole time. No matter what Book of Boba Fett may lead you to think.
Oh, I was referencing the legends, not the current canon. But is that how it is in Book of Boba Fett too? Well, I haven't seen that.
No, he just gets out.
It's just stupid.
I hate Book of Boba Fett so much.
He just walks out the front door.
So the one more.
I simply refuse to be eaten. Goodbye.
Pretty much. You're not far off. And it's upsetting.
Because I feel like I've touched a nerve here talking about Star Wars.
Please
take us away.
Take us away from Book of Boba Fett.
The last thing I actually wanted to mention about fictional people eating plants is something I learned about today called the Madagascar tree. And there's not a whole lot to it. I mean, there's a pretty elaborate description of how it has basically tentacle-like branches that it can move and like ensnare people and pull them into it, and it's it's described. It almost feels like a Lovecraftian horror. But what I thought was interesting about this was obviously it's not real, but it's not from a work of proposed fiction. It's actually from a journal that accounts travels in Madagascar. It was written by Edmund Spencer for a publication called New York World, and he described this plant as something he came across, or rather a German explorer came across in Madagascar in 1874, and it wasn't until 1955 that people disproved or proved that this was a hoax. So like a lot of people, it was shared in a lot of different publications that there were like people, in like Europe and late 1800s America that just believed there were man-eating trees in Madagascar. And I thought that was really interesting.
That is.
That is really interesting. It actually, one of the other real plants that I wanted to talk about reminds me a little bit of this. Madagascar is the wrong part of the world because this is in Southeast Asia. Triphyophyllum peltatum is the name of it. It's quite a mouthful. It is what many people also claim to be the, quote, largest carnivorous plant. But what's interesting about it is that it is only sometimes carnivorous.
Oh, interesting.
It goes through, in its life cycle, its leaves go through several different types of leaf. And it is only when certain conditions are met that certain nutrients are not coming from the soil that it starts to develop leaves that basically they're kind of like how the sundew works, that it's like the central vein of a leaf, but then instead of blade material on the leaf, it just has these little tendrils that secrete little like drops of stickiness that bugs and things will get caught in. But with the plant that you were just the Madagascar plant that you were just talking about, kind of reaching out and pulling people in. So this peltatum is considered the largest carnivorous plant because it is a vine, and it can grow. The vines can be 40 feet long, but the carnivorous leaves, when it grows them, are usually 5 or 6 inches, but they've been seen up to about 18 inches. And they work like reverse fiddleheads, that something comes in and then they curl back on themselves to keep whatever it is trapped. And so that's almost large enough that if a person were weak enough, that plant could, like, if you were just kind of walking through the jungle, I guess, and it's like a spider web, and sometimes suddenly you brush your wrist against this thing, and it could wrap around your wrist. It's cool. Big enough that it could wrap all the way around your wrist. And again, you would probably feel kind of like you had a sunburn there if you stayed there for a long while. And ultimately, most humans that would be casually walking through a jungle are probably strong enough to counteract the curling that this plant is doing. But I thought that was kind of a neat thing, that it's just, it kind of has these long tentacles of carnivorous plant goo.
It's very like inspiration for Jumanji sort of stuff.
Yeah, a little bit. It's also something that the next time I need to use assassin vines in my D&D campaign, I might add a certain digestive quality to them.
Yes. Art imitates life.
Yes.
The other big thing that I think is a strike against a carnivorous plant eating a human is that carnivorous plants have to have a way to lure in their prey. And so with things like insects, it's the smell of rotting meat. Maybe it's the smell of something sweet that might lure in certain insects or small mammals. But the animals in question, they get there and they see that they're looking for whatever the smell is, and they don't necessarily find it before falling in and getting digested or what have you. Humans are going to get to the plant and they're going to be like, oh, it's one of these things that eats people. I'm going to go the other direction. So the plant would have to come up with some kind of mechanism that would sort of trick the human, I guess, because we're smart enough to reason our way out of a situation where we just walk into an open pitcher plant.
That's really neat, because I didn't even consider that. Everything I was considering is like just mechanically could the plant dissolve a human. So I even thought, leaving your finger in a Venus flytrap intentionally long enough. And that's an excellent point, that naturally they'd have to develop a way to do it.
Yeah, I was thinking about this too, and the best that I imagined, so there are a lot of different species of pitcher plants, and I love pitcher plants. They're so freaking cool. But I've at some point on a previous episode, I know that I've talked about Victory Bell, the Pokemon, and so I know I've talked about pitcher plants here before, and I think I've mentioned that there are some species, many pitcher plant species have multiple types of pitcher that they develop.
Yeah, I remember that.
Usually there's a variety of, it develops a pitcher leaf on near the ground, and then they also develop them that kind of are up taller, higher. There are a couple of pitcher plants that have actually developed different lures for their different pitchers. So like the pitcher that is closer to the ground is more likely to lure in beetles and ants, and the pitcher that is up, hanging from a taller point on the plant is more likely to attract things like flies and mosquitoes. So I was thinking about like how would a human actually get fooled into this, and I started thinking, well, okay, what if a pitcher plant developed a more complicated root system, but somehow that didn't negate the need for being carnivorous? Because like that's one of the things that carnivorous plants share, is that their root systems are kind of atrophied. That's why they need to be carnivorous.
Mm.
But imagine the pitcher plant developed a more complicated root system, and then its pitchers developed underground.
Oh, okay. Like a trap door.
And then you wind up with a pit instead of a pitcher. And so you're just kind of walking through the jungle, and you avoid that peltatum that's trying to grab at your wrist, and that sends you just fall straight into a pit.
Yeah.
And suddenly you're being digested by a pitcher plant.
Naturally occurring tiger pits.
Yeah, something like that. Or, are there... I don't think there are any plants that create noise, are there?
Not that I know of, but that...
I wonder.
Because
good question.
How cool would it be? How terrifying would it be if a pitcher plant developed like an underground pitcher that just had like a flap above ground, and then somehow was able to develop just this little kind of noise underground?
This is unverified because I just looked it up now, so I'll do more research. But apparently, plants might emit ultrasonic popping sounds when they are like dehydrated.
I saw that. Yeah, I just googled the same thing. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So that's as much as so likely there aren't any super huge known, but that's such a cool idea.
Yeah, that would be terrifying. But I will say though, this is related, but not really in line with the question. Something that I did find, more evidence that pitcher plants are cool.
We needed it.
So, they're not emitting noise, but there is a species of pitcher plant that has that has evolved in sync with a species of woolly bat in its environment. That so pitcher plants kind of have that hood over the pitcher, and so this particular species of pitcher plant is in an environment with multiple species of pitcher plant that are mostly larger than this particular species. And they have then developed the hood of their pitcher to be kind of a reflector dish, a sonic reflector dish.
Oh.
So these bats are able to fly around, and their echolocation really picks up on this particular species of pitcher plant. And what's cool is that this species of pitcher plant is small enough that it cannot digest, like the bat cannot fall into the digestive juices of the pitcher, but it's large enough that the bat can crawl into the pitcher itself. And so the bats fly around, and then they crawl into the pitcher plant and use it as a sleeping bag. And they just sleep in the pitcher, and while they're sleeping in the pitcher, they poop in the pitcher. And it turns out bat poop is good soup. And the pitcher plant gets a lot of nutrients out of that, and the bat gets a safe place to stay when it's sleeping. It's kind of wonderful.
I like where that went, because I was going to be like, but I like bats. And
yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I think that's actually really interesting. Maybe some pitcher plants out there could turn into toilets.
There you go. Yeah.
And live in symbiosis with humans.
In a lot of ways, that might be good, because a lot of the stuff, like a lot of things that are undigested still have a lot of nutrients in them because
Yeah.
like humans or other animals maybe can't break those things down, but they do weaken them a little bit. So like, for instance, a lot of times, poop makes great fertilizer. So same thing with a pitcher plant. Maybe it just should be a toilet.
Yeah. So, hey, it can't eat a human, but it can eat a human's poop.
Recycling.
Yay.
Perfect.
Well, I think that's a good enough point to move on to our next question.
Sounds good to me.
I just want to reiterate, bat sleeping bags.
Yeah, that's adorable.
It is.
So question 2 this week. Well, topic 2 this week, I suppose.
Mhm.
Compare historical versus fantasy weapons and how they have influenced each other through history and media, both accurately and inaccurately. And you would not get any points for this on Jeopardy.
But yeah, that's true.
It is definitely not worded in the form of a question. So yeah, weapons in media and in history. Right?
Yeah,
mm-hmm.
And how do they compare?
I mean, I would start off by just pointing out, like, there are a lot of weapons in fantasy, and to a similar degree, there's a lot of the same weapons in like sci-fi, especially like space fantasy, like space operas and that sort of thing, that are very heavily inspired by the weapons of the real world, but frequently turned into something impractical.
Like the Batleth?
Yes, like that exactly. And the thing that I've noticed, sort of going through a lot of the quote unquote famous iterations of weapons, is just that, like, after a certain point, they just become art pieces, and they are either too heavy or too fragile or too unwieldy to really use as like their intended purpose. You could absolutely use them as a bludgeoning device. Anything can be a bludgeoning device. Like,
yeah.
I mean, the Batleth is just a really fancy club.
Yeah.
A thing I wanted to mention about this is I'm really interested in this topic of like making fantasy weapons sort of based on something realistic. And a lot of times when I've argued with things, like, I've never gotten into like a heated argument about anything, but a lot of times people will say, just accept it because it's fantasy and it's the rule of cool.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I understand the rule of cool, but like, I also think that it's really cool when I could see like somebody wielding a sword that I'm like, I totally know why all these intricate designs are there.
Mm-hmm.
Like that might just be me, but I wanted to say it.
Oh yeah.
Well, no, I absolutely agree with you, and it's one of the things that so for our listeners who are not aware, I am a theatrical fight choreographer among a variety of other things, and so like when I watch a movie and there's a sword fight in it, there's a layer to it that I'm like, this is I am looking at it in a slightly different way than many of the intended audience will look at it.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I often see is just, why is this movement part of the choreographic choice?
Oh, yeah.
And like lightsabers are a big part of it.
Mm-hmm.
That, well, they're not. They're a frequent topic that I look at, and there's a lot to it that it's like, okay, if you have this weapon, I understand why there's a lot of kendo that went into lightsabers. There's a lot of, in more recent Star Wars media, there's a lot of traditional German longsword work that has gone into the choreography. And so all of that is great, but then we also have all of the things where people are just spinning the sword around for no apparent reason.
And jumping flips and stuff.
Yeah.
And jumping flips and things. And that's all very cool. It's very cinematic. But the place where it becomes a problem for me, like, so there's a place in Return of the Jedi where we see Luke do kind of a backflip above the Sarlacc pit, and he catches the lightsaber and does some spins with it, some what we call Moline's, windmill spins. And it kind of makes a lot of sense because it is a moment where he is trying to be distracting. It is a moment where he has the element of surprise. It is a moment where he is literally using a diving board to fly through the air. And so all of it kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
And then we go into someplace like the prequels, and we see Anakin and Obi-Wan fighting Count Dooku. And it's just all of these flashy, like, swoosh, 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 swoosh. And there's not actually anything happening. And it's very flashy, and it's very, seizure-inducing on the screen. But martially, it doesn't mean anything.
Right.
Yeah.
And I do have a problem with that. I agree that, yes, okay, it's a space fantasy. These are laser swords. They are not real. Great. I appreciate the rule of cool.
Yeah.
But I would like the rule of cool to be grounded in something sensible.
Yeah, yeah. The prequels are full of these extremely flashy moves where I feel like even a casual audience can look at that and be like, they weren't even aiming at where the person is. They're aiming at the other person's sword, and that's not how you do it.
Yeah.
The fight between Anakin and Obi-Wan, particularly in the end of episode 3, is just like, it starts with them just twisting their lightsabers like back and forth parallel to each other and like hitting the swords together, but not even getting close to the other person's body. The fight with General Grievous that Obi-Wan does, General Grievous could have used all four of those swords and chose not to. So those are the kinds of things I think about.
At any point in time.
Yeah, which is a shame, because as far as like fantasy weapons goes, the lightsaber is really great. It's just a laser. It cuts through like a lot of things. There's nothing frilly or fancy. It's a very light weapon. It's easy to store. It's easy to smuggle into places. It's a great weapon inspired by a sword it's just like Sword 2.0. It's great. I love it.
But yeah, one of the things that there was a lot of stuff in here that I could talk about. We could make this a very, very long episode if you wanted to let me. But talking about Bob Anderson is actually something that I really wanted to talk about, how we got from real swordplay to what we see in a lot of movies.
Okay.
And Bob Anderson is kind of at one end of a lineage of people that got us there. In 1920, we have Mark of Zorro, which is a silent movie, Douglas Fairbanks Sr., one of the first really big swashbuckler movies.
It's a good one.
And, it's excellent. It's got a lot of big sword fight going on in it. And the thing is, at that time, there wasn't a lot of, there was no fight choreography that was being done. There also wasn't a lot of historical swordplay study being done. So there weren't really people that you could go to and just say, hey, how do you use a rapier? If you were doing Japanese swordplay, they have schools that have had continual instruction for centuries. But when you come to Western swordplay, once people stopped using rapiers and moved to small swords, people stopped teaching how to use rapiers. And then once we moved from small swords into sport fencing, people, for the most part, kind of stopped teaching how to use swords to kill each other. So when we got to this point where we're making Mark of Zorro and we need a sword fight, we got a guy named Richard Talmadge, who was a German dude who had done a lot of he had some like circus background, but he also had some fencing background. And so Talmadge started doing all of this stuff in the movies, teaching people how to do fencing. And occasionally also served as Douglas Fairbanks Sr.'s stunt double, which is how a lot of people got into this early on. And we wound up developing this style of what we now call swashbuckling swordplay that is based in large part on Olympic-style sport fencing made bigger. So if you ever watch sport fencing now, it's very difficult to follow, especially now contemporary sport fencing moves so fast. The movements are so small. But if you take the idea behind it and start making it bigger so that an audience can follow what's going on, you start making it slower so that, especially when we're talking in the 1920s, so that the camera can actually catch the movement.
Okay.
Yeah.
And we start getting bigger movements. And that's where we start getting this. And then that develops into what we see with Fairbanks Jr., and eventually getting into the Errol Flynn movies. And Errol Flynn, of course, is kind of the golden age in the 50s of Hollywood swashbuckling.
Oh, yeah.
And in the 50s, we really get this Olympic fencing style of swashbuckling really becomes solidified, and a lot of it happens because of a man named Patrick Crane. Most famous movie you would know, probably Master of Ballantrae, is something that Patty Crane did. But Patty Crane worked a lot with Errol Flynn, did a lot of stuff through the 50s, on into the 60s, and well past that. He passed away in the early 2000s, I think 2003, and I believe he was in his 90s, and he had been pretty active up through his 70s doing stuff. But he was originally, like, Olympic fencing was what Patty Crane did, and he developed, not only did he work in films to create all of this, but he also worked a lot in theater, and he developed a lot of the safety measures that we take now, a lot of the system of this is how we make our targets, this is how we make cuts so that they don't actually hurt the other actor, this sort of thing.
Yeah.
And then he had several people that worked with him, that apprenticed under him, that eventually got us into places like what we see now in our Star Wars movies and so forth. So it's a long history, but that Hollywood swashbuckling swordplay, I always love to talk about it because it is a wholly unique swordplay method, because it is very much, it is not based on real I'm going to kill you now sword technique, but if we think of it as being developed out of sport fencing, sport fencing was developed out of small sword play, which is what small sword is what would have been used by nobility during the American Revolutionary War period. And small sword developed out of rapier. And so you can go back and find the history of this that takes you all the way back to genuine, we're going to stab each other kind of weapons. But it has taken such a circuitous route to get to what we think of as Hollywood swashbuckling.
Yeah. And the two things that stand out about that to me is obviously the thing that we have talked about before, where in movies and even in theater, the sword play isn't I'm gonna kill you, it's we're telling a story.
Yeah.
Yes.
And the tournament, like sport fencing, is done on a straight line, which translates really well to a proscenium stage where you want the audience to be able to see both of the competitors.
And it works really well for film when you don't have a lot of mobile camera apparatus, which a lot of that early Hollywood swashbuckling stuff, you didn't have Steadicam. You didn't have a lot of ways to move the camera around. So having something that this is going to move straight back and forth in this space.
Yeah.
So we can put the camera here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which is really useful.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's largely the case in fantasy movies and a lot of... I mean, I feel like this is also true in even things like comic books in a lot of ways, because like a fight in a comic book is also there to tell a story, and whether it's and it's a weird pull because we're talking about weapons, but I'm thinking specifically of things like Dragon Ball Z, like the manga and Dragon Ball, where sure, they're using a lot of real martial arts moves, but in the end it sort of just evolves into like fist fights. But it's also just sort of there to fill space as the characters are fleshed out. It's not something you see in the anime at all, because the anime is 95% filler. But
sure, yeah.
But in the manga, a lot of the fights are like, oh, I punched you, and now we have like a box of dialogue, and then I punch you again, and then another thing happens, and it's
right.
Yeah.
Well, in a real fight, Spider-Man would never have time to be as quippy as he is in the comic books.
Yeah.
But that's really important to the character of Spider-Man. It's really important to his character development, so that that when he gets quiet, that's when he means it.
Yeah.
But yeah, and the storytelling of a fight is something that I think is really cool, and it is. We wind up with I do think there's some correlation in what we see particularly in films, and what we see in reality. There's certainly, as Hollywood gun fu has become more of a thing, there's a lot of this idea of holding a gun in one hand, or having two pistols that you're using, and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And, there are people out there who are using firearms in ways that they think, like they grew up seeing firearms being used this way in media.
Yeah.
And I don't have anything other than anecdotal knowledge to really go down that path. But I do think it's there.
Well, I talked about the idea that if you punch while pulling the trigger of a gun, it's like the bullet will hit harder because you're
absolutely. Absolutely. Or if you do it just right, then you can make the trajectory of the bullet turn.
You can curve bullets. Yeah.
Curve those bullets.
But actually, in a similar note, though, I think it's interesting how there, in settings that would be appropriate to have things like flintlock pistols or muskets, you don't really see them that often. Like, guns have been around for a fairly long time, longer than people think. And I think it would be interesting to see a setting where you have very primitive, one-shot shoulder guns, and also swords and other melee weapons. And you don't see that very often.
I always rant about people that I've played Dungeons and Dragons with, or whatever role-playing game, and they don't allow firearms. They don't allow gunslingers to exist because they just think it doesn't fit the time period, and yet you have broadswords fighting against rapiers. And can I point out the inconsistency there?
Actually, speaking of D&D weapons, you know what I think doesn't get nearly as much love as it should is glaives and pole arms and really long things that are not spears.
Can I go on? Can I go on a tangent here?
As long as it's about glaives or pole arms.
It's about glaives or pole arms. I looked at, I guess, kind of ignoring fantasy to an extent, just the historical evolution of some of these weapons. A lot of weapons that we know of were repurposed farm equipment and farm tools, because a lot of peasant classes, when they would have to fight heavily armed soldiers and stuff, they would have to use what they had. And a lot of pole arms come from like pitchforks being repurposed. And to sort of answer the question, how has fantasy interpreted that in an ineffectual way? The idea of a battle scythe is from the idea of people, reaping wheat with a scythe, and then they had to repurpose it for battle. But what they would do is they'd turn the blade so that it would point out, so you could actually hit somebody with it. And I have seen so many like fighting games and anime and stuff where a character is using a scythe and the blade is curved in on you.
Yeah.
Again, rule of cool. It looks cool. It evokes the idea of the Grim Reaper, but to use it in combat you'd be at a huge disadvantage.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is not a great weapon in that configuration.
Although the Gundam Death Scythe it's a beam weapon, so I mean it's just gonna burn through anything anyway. So you could do whatever you want with that one.
55 minutes.
Gundam is fantasy. Let's be real here.
I know.
Absolutely.
I just wanted to say.
But I mean, I don't know why, but ever since like in Sailor Moon, Sailor Saturn has a glaive, and I'm like, you should fight with that glaive. And Sailor Saturn is like a weird character that doesn't really do much for story reasons. There's like a whole reason why Sailor Saturn is like the most powerful one and could like end the world if she actually fought. Well, so there's good reasons for this. Yeah. But she has a glaive, and I'm like, swing that thing.
Keep a lid on that.
Yeah. I like that thing. It's cool. And ever since then, I'm like, we need more glaives in more movies.
I also wanted to say, I thought of two examples because I actually thought of like a lot of examples of fictional weapons that I could have mentioned. And one of my biggest hangups was a lot of these, I didn't know how obscure of a reference they were. I didn't want to just have to flood the show notes with a bunch of pictures because I hate doing that. But so I was like, oh, I could reference this thing from this video game I know, but I didn't know. So I did want to point out that this is actually a very good idea for like a video topic. And I am linking a YouTuber that I used to watch who did kind of this examining popular fictional weapons and saying how would they actually, compare to a real weapon. But I thought of things like the Buster Sword and the Dragon Slayer from Berserk and all sorts of. So I picked two that one is a bit more obscure, but there's a reason I want to talk about them. One is the Keyblade from Kingdom Hearts, and this is an impractical weapon. And the main thing that I want to point out is that
I love Keyblades.
The main thing that
they are the worst.
The main thing I want to harp on about the Keyblade is that the original design, I didn't follow the series, but the original design of Keyblade is that the handguard, the finger guard, exists on both sides of the handle.
It's awful.
Oh, yeah.
You would break your wrist.
It's so bad.
It's so bad. But then to contrast that to another one, there's an anime called Kill la Kill. It's by the people who did Gurren Lagann and
Studio Trigger.
Jim put a picture of this in the show notes because I do want to reference this. It's called the Scissor Blade, I believe. Mm-hmm. And I can describe it as it's just if you take a pair of scissors and you break it apart and just have one half of it. And this is actually a fairly functional weapon. Like you have a finger guard on the handle and then it's just a blade that extends beyond that. So
yeah.
What's that one? It's about the samurai.
Rurouni Kenshin.
That's it.
With the backwards blade.
Yeah.
Rurouni Kenshin has a katana that the sharp part is the one that is facing you.
Yeah.
That was rooted in more realistic history, but I haven't watched that show in so long that I don't remember anything about it.
Yeah. I've actually only seen, I think, one or two episodes of it. It's been a very, very long time.
A lot of people I know really liked it back in the day. I don't know if it holds up. Yeah. I hear it's good.
Well, I mean, It's an anime that was made before the 2000s, and people still remember it.
That's
so
fair.
that implies that it's probably decent.
It must have been decent. Yeah. There's one more thing that I have listed on my notes that I wanted to bring up. It's in the same vein as the battle scythe. For a specific reason, I wanted to talk about nunchucks.
Oh.
Yay! And this is going to oversimplify a ton of stuff, but we don't actually really know the origin of nunchucks. The best guess we have is that it comes from Okinawa, and that it was a tool possibly used for threshing rice. But, like using other farm equipment, you can do damage with it, and it works essentially like a flail. But the biggest interesting thing to me about it is that it's most famous, arguably, because of Bruce Lee and other martial arts films. And it's a tool that is really cool looking. So it's kind of like comparing if you put the art in martial arts, it's like a juggling trick kind of, but to actually use it in combat, there's a significant danger of hitting yourself as much as hitting somebody else with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can do a lot of damage with it, but some of that damage might be on you.
Yeah.
And it is something that the Western European flail, this is another place where there's a major departure between what was real and what comes in media, is we think of a flail as like you have a handle, and then there's a length of chain, and then there's a ball on the end of it. And you swing that around and you hit things. And there were some weapons that were kind of like that. The most similar thing to that is actually a Japanese weapon, the Manriki Gazari, that is a chain weapon with a weight on the end. But the real flail that a foot soldier would have used in Europe was a pretty long handle. There are some that were as short as 2 feet in length, but a lot of them were pole arms with a pretty much just like a single link of chain, so almost more of a hinge rather than chain, than a lot of chain. And then a weight, usually another piece of wood, sometimes with like iron studs nailed into it or something. Still a devastating weapon, particularly because if it's a pole arm, I can swing it really, really hard to hit you with it. And because my handle is longer than the weight at the end of it, if the weight does bounce and swing back to me, it will hit the handle very far away from my hands. And nunchucks are very hard to... they are harder to control in that way, because if something happens to cause the striking end of the nunchuck to swing back, then it is the same length as the thing you're holding. So it is very easy for it to come back and strike your hand. To say nothing, of course, of you doing some crazy flip with it and hitting yourself in the back of the head. But Bruce Lee and nunchucks is actually one of the other things that I wanted to kind of mention in this, in media affecting real life, is Bruce Lee is really the reason that nunchucks have the cultural cache that they have here in the United States and worldwide. But it's something that, because he used them in a couple of movies, they became a very cool thing. And now there are martial arts schools across the country that include nunchuck technique as part of their curriculum. And there's a really solid argument to be made that nunchucks would not be one of the weapons that was commonplace in dojos across the country, if not for Bruce Lee. And in the same vein, we were talking about Star Wars earlier. There are in a lot of cities now, there are lightsaber dual academies and people who get together to fight with lightsabers, because we now have the technology that we have these really cool light up polycarbonate blades that can actually take an impact. So why not go bashing each other with them?
Yeah.
It's a good time.
That is not what I thought you were going to say.
Yeah, me neither, but I'm glad we went there.
When you said, and now because of Star Wars, and I thought you were going to say, we actually have lightsaber nunchucks.
Why don't they?
And I was like, I'm out. I'm sorry.
I'm ready for
there are
lightsaber
people
nunchucks.
who have made them, but
So I cannot abide this.
But no, there is a subset of an athletic community that has taken these weapons that we see in movies and they're essentially, let's call it what it is. It's LARPing.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
But there are people training in the use of these weapons because we have seen those weapons in this media.
That's a thing that we will utilize in the future, because they're not going to stop making movies when that is a skill set that we need.
Yeah.
I mean, so that's awesome.
Yep.
The last one I wanted to throw in there is that you never see chakram. I know they're not like super practical, and like once you throw them, they don't come back to you like they do in the cartoons and the video games, but I like them.
They don't work like Xena.
They do not. I want to see more of them though, because they're cool.
Yeah, but they are a real weapon. It is a historically present weapon.
Mm-hmm.
It's good stuff.
Mm-hmm.
What I have left, I don't really have big segues into.
That's usually how I do it.
A random thing that I think is worth mentioning is the collectible sword and prop economy that exists.
Like wall hanger type stuff?
Yeah, so there's wall hanger type stuff that like you can get a replica of the sword that Arnold Schwarzenegger used as Conan the Barbarian.
Yeah.
You can get a replica of Hadafang, Arwen's sword from The Lord of the Rings. And that's certainly a thing that obviously is affected by media. And they are... I have held a replica of both of those that I mentioned. And they are terrible swords. Even setting aside, like, accepting that the replicas that I had are clearly not made of great materials for swords, just, like, they are difficult to hold. They are heavy in places they shouldn't be heavy. They're not great. Mm-hmm. Arnold needed all of those muscles to move that sword around the way he did.
That reminds me of all the replicas I've seen of the Buster Sword from Final Fantasy VII.
Yeah.
And
right.
Sure, in the game it looks great. It's really cool. And Cloud is, mostly Popeye shaped so he can hold it. But in real life, it is very difficult to carry one of those things.
Oh, yeah.
I do want to touch on, so I mentioned the Buster Sword, I mentioned the Dragon Slayer. These are like 8-foot long blades of these sheets of metal. Mm-hmm. And we all know the problem with that is you could not, like, one of the biggest things you want in a fight is speed, and probably either above that or under that is just the ability to lift the thing you're carrying. That's important.
Mm-hmm. It's important.
Yes. But for those of you who are familiar with the story of Final Fantasy VII, I know it's been a while, so that's not a guarantee anymore, but both the Buster Sword and in the manga Berserk, the Dragon Slayer, and even I'll go so far as to say Evil Dead, the character who wields a chainsaw as a weapon, in addition to that being just super groovy. These are often things, thank you. These are often things that are put intentionally into stories to signify somebody lacking control, somebody lacking balance. And in the example of Cloud Strife wielding the Buster Sword, it is a symbol of him not being able to live up to the fake persona he has created in his head, which I just thought was really interesting. So, yeah, bad practical weapon, but for a story reason.
Yeah,
there's some really interesting stuff. This all ties into, you look at any character wielding a weapon, and if you are dealing with well-made media, then the weapon they are using has a great deal of meaning for that character.
Yeah.
And that's true. You look at Final Fantasy VII, and you look at Sephiroth, and the sword that Sephiroth has, which is a 12-foot long katana, completely impractical. How do you even carry that? How do you get it through doorways? But it's very much something that it looks like an elegant weapon, but it is actually a pretty vicious weapon. It is a weapon that he uses in surprisingly precise ways.
Yeah.
So, there's a lot that you can see in there. One of my favorite sword fight movies, Rob Roy, with Liam Neeson. There are, and Tim Roth. There's these two characters go through this whole movie, and Liam Neeson's character, Rob Roy, uses a Scottish backsword, which is this huge, heavy blade with a big cage around the hand. And Tim Roth, who's kind of the antagonist of the piece, the villain of the piece, uses a small, light sword. It is a cut and thrust, but it's very close. It's more like a transitional rapier, getting close to being a small sword. And the thing is, Rob Roy is this very straightforward, intentional, strong character. And so the sword that he uses is, in addition to being a historically accurate weapon for the setting and the character to use, it is a weapon that is straightforward. I will position my body in a way that I can swing this thing and it will hit you and you will die. That's kind of the attitude of the weapon. Tim Roth's weapon is a weapon of deceit. It is a weapon of speed. It is a weapon of being... It's a weaselly kind of weapon.
Yeah.
And the choreography in those fights bears all of that out, and it matches their characters really well.
That's why rogues use daggers.
That is one reason that rogues use daggers. But yeah, Rob Roy, it's a movie you should watch if you haven't seen it. It's one of the finest sword fights put to film. Really, really good.
Cool.
All right, listeners, this week, compare historical versus fantasy carnivorous plants. And Jim, where do we get all these wacky questions?
Well, that's a great question. Before we jump into that, I do want to mention that we are actually going to start phasing out our listener mail segment, not because we don't love getting your listener mails, but because we want to just extend the amount of time we have for questions. And we want to just bleed into that extra, 5 or so minutes that we spend talking about listener mails on the show. We still will be talking about those listener mails in our Discord server. So, please keep sending them because we do talk about them a lot behind the scenes. But if you want to send us some feedback, There's always feedback at vaguelyscientific.com. You can comment on our blog. You can like us on Facebook. You can tweet at vaguelysci. And if you have a question that needs to be answered in a vaguely scientific manner, please email us at questions@vaguelyscientific.com. If you want to get our episodes the minute that they're released, you can subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and all the other great places that cool podcasts like to hang out. And subscribing and leaving feedback really helps us out, and so does telling your friends.
And you can tell those friends we talked about Star Wars again, so they're welcome to send us hate mail.
Yeah, that's the last thing we need. We're getting rid of the listener mail. We're just going to get a bunch of hate mail in the box now. So, our Vaguely musical intro is composed by Anthony Pizzelli. And don't forget to check out our merch store over at vaguelyscientific.threadless.com. There's all kinds of great designs on there, and you can get them on pretty much any kind of merch that you can think of. So check it out and see what you like.
And thank you to Adam for being our guest this week.
Glad to do it.
Always
Thank you
a
for
pleasure.
letting me ramble on about swords.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm a history nerd, so I enjoyed it.
I thought it was super interesting, to be honest with you, because, like, I don't know a ton about swords and weapons, so I loved it.
Well, good. I'm glad.
I learned a lot about Star Wars, too.
Every time we talk about Star Wars, I learn what we talk about Star Wars.
Yeah. Yeah, I know some about Star Wars, but I don't know a lot of the behind-the-scenes stuff, which I think is cool.
Yeah. For Vaguely Scientific, I am Derek.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Adam.
Heroes in a Half Shell, Turtle Power.
Toodaloo.
Jim, did you have thoughts? Would you like to do this thing later, or we can knock that
No, let's
out?
just do it later, yeah.
Do it later.
Do
Okay.
what?
We're talking about like recording a plug for something, and
Oh, okay.
we'll do it another time.
Mm-hmm.
I just thought it was funny that that you asked Jim if he had thoughts, and he said he'd rather do that later.
Yeah, I'd rather think later.
Yeah, thinking is never a now thing.